Hi, good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, depending on where you're joining us from. My name is Sana Megani, and we are very excited to have you here with us today. I will allow for just a few moments for participants to join in and settle down, and then we'll get started. Okay, so it looks like we have quite a few that have joined live. If you just are joining us, good morning, good afternoon. Thank you for being with us today for this really important webinar. So we'll go ahead, if my panelists are all ready, it looks like everyone's on. We'll go ahead and get started. So my name is Sana Megani, and I am a program manager here at Trellis Company. I work with the student and institutional success team to develop and implement successful strategies and campaigns to improve outcomes for students at minority serving institutions across the country. I've worked in student success and access programs at nonprofits at the University of Texas at Austin, Longhorn, and also UC San Diego, which is my alma mater. My background has been in retention, student success, and primarily focused on serving first gen and minority students. My co-presenters that I have with me today, the first one is Brian Ashton. Brian is the Vice President of Community Investment and Government Affairs at Trellis. In this role, Brian is responsible for leading the organization's college university support efforts, student support efforts, including student financial coaching services and financial literacy efforts. He also leads the higher education policy and research efforts. Additionally, Brian is the co-founder and managing director of the Higher Education Financial Wellness Alliance, and he formerly managed financial wellness initiatives at Ohio State University. Also on today is Steve Smith. He is the director of Student Success Initiatives. Steve Smith has worked in higher education for over 30 years. He was an academic program administrator and financial aid officer at the City University of New York. Later, he worked in public relations, policy and regulatory affairs, and strategic planning at Texas Guaranteed. From 2005 through to 2017, he was vice president, then president of Le Cordon Bleu College of Culinary Arts. In 2017, Steve came back to Trellis Company as director of student success initiatives, focusing on student retention, persistence, outreach to, especially to minority serving institutions. So thank you both for joining me. Also in the background, behind the scenes, I have Zach Taylor and Ryan Pica. They are my colleagues and a part of our team here, and they will be assisting in answering your questions as well as helping us moderate the questions at the end. So feel free to chat those to us throughout, and we will do our best to answer them at the end. We have a big number of participants here, and so if we can't answer all of your questions at the end, when I send out the slide deck and the webinar recording, feel free to message me back, and if there's anything that we weren't able to cover today, we will do our best to do so then. Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. So for this webinar, just to kind of get everyone on the same page, our presentation is grounded in both research and practice in serving students experiencing economic emergencies and basic need insecurities. And this reflects the current success strategies in higher education. So we have combined both our experience and work as practitioners along with research to provide a pretty comprehensive webinar for you here today. Here's what we'll cover. We'll cover the CARES Act, what we know so far, and as everyone knows, that's changing on a daily basis, but we'll cover what we know and considerations. We'll provide an overview of emergency aid programs, and then we'll cover the current practices for creating and operating programs, do an overview of the administration and post-award process. And then we'll review anticipated hurdles to implementation, and we'll provide you a really great list of resources as well as references for all of the research and any citations we have in our slide deck here today. And then we'll end with a summary of shared practices and questions. So again, feel free to use the Q&A feature or the chat feature throughout the presentation, and my colleagues who are behind the scenes will help you. And if you have any issues about connectivity or audio or need a link, send that to us as well and we'll assist you. Okay, with that, I will hand it over to my colleague, Brian.
Good afternoon, or good morning, everybody. I appreciate you all jumping on today and taking the time to talk about this incredibly important topic. one of the things that we've realized over the last few weeks is that there is a growing interest in emergency aid programs, partially because of the need that campuses are recognizing within their student bodies, but also because of the CARES Act funding, which we'll talk about here in a minute. Wanted to start by providing a little bit of context for Trellis and the emergency aid programs that we support. And so we initially created an emergency aid program in 2017. As a part of that program, we supported 27 minority serving institutions across Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Oklahoma, and Texas. And really the way that we designed our program was twofold. One was to create a structure for the disbursement of student aid on the campuses that we serve. And the second was to provide a level of institutional capacity building funds, which would help campuses to administer the day-to-day program on their individual campus. Throughout that process, we also provided technical assistance to the campuses that we were supporting, and we're using that to drive some of the lessons learned that we'll talk about here today. If we go to the next slide, we wanted to start by providing a little bit of an overview of the CARES Act. And so we've seen a lot of conversation about the CARES Act and what it will do for our institutions of higher education. There's two sections of the CARES Act that relate to emergency aid. The first is that Section 3504, which allows for supplemental education opportunity grants to be used for emergency aid purposes. And so in a scenario where a campus has carry forward of SEOG, that can be provided to students in the form of emergency aid. This section is a little bit more defined than some of the other sections of the CARES Act, but it does allow for that to be packaged up to the Pell Grant cost, and it does not need to be counted as a financial resource for the students that are receiving it. Additionally, it has some of the same provisions that we'll talk about here in the second section for what it can be used for to support students. The second component of the CARES Act that directly relates to emergency aid is actually a much larger fund for many of our campuses that are on the line today. And this is the Higher Education Relief Fund. And so as a part of this, there's two different buckets of funding that institutions will receive. The first is to be used for institutional responses to COVID-19. This includes things like transitioning to distance learning or some of the costs associated with moving operations or lost revenue from operations. But the CARES Act also specifies that 50% of the funds that are allocated under the Higher Education Relief Fund must be used to support students that are facing emergency needs as a result of the disruption of campus operations because of COVID-19. This includes what would be eligible expenses over costs of attendance. And so this is one element that is consistent across the SEOG allocation as well as the Higher Education Relief Fund allocation. So this can be things like food, housing, course materials, technology, healthcare, childcare, and other areas that again are part of that traditional cost of attendance calculation. If we move to the next slide, one of the things that is true for the CARES Act funding that we currently have appropriated is a lot of the actual implementation of the guidance has been left up to what we would refer to as administrative guidance. And so the Department of Education is really in the driver's seat for a lot of the unknown questions that we have related to CARES Act funding. But what we think we know right now is that there will be approximately $14 billion that are allocated to institutions to be used for this response. So if you look at 50% of that, we would be targeting about $7 billion of that to go directly to support their emergencies that they are experiencing. We're also anticipating, based on conversations, that this will be distributed via current Title IV systems that are in place. And we do have guidance that this would not be included in the need analysis for students. As of right now, if it's dispersed prior to June 30th of 2020, and there's some ambiguity about that moving beyond June 30th of 2020. We can have everybody please mute in the bottom left-hand corner if they are not currently on mute. That would help with some of the feedback that I believe individuals are experiencing right now. Thank you. As we sort of allow for the ongoing process of guidance issuing, one of the things that we wanted to do with this webinar is to provide some things that we think that campuses can do in the interim while we're waiting on this guidance to be provided by the Department of Education. As we navigate that process, there are a few major questions that we're still waiting for answers from the department on. The first is what would be considered an allowable expense. So we have in the broad legislative language this idea of emergencies as it relates to cost of attendance. Well, we don't have as specifics around that. So we're unclear as to what that means for who is being paid. Is it the student, is it a vendor, or is it the institution if there's a past due receivable? We're unclear as to whether or not within those cost of attendance categories there will be restrictions placed on individual items that can be covered under the emergency. We're also unclear on how the department will provide guidance for the distribution of the money. And so whether this will follow some relevant Title IV regulations or whether this will be more freeform remains to be seen as guidance is still forthcoming. That also impacts when money will be distributed, both from the department to the institutions, but then when the expectation is for the funding to be distributed from institutions to individuals. Judging by the 630 guidance, I think we anticipate that this will be coming sooner rather than later to kind of fulfill that intent of it being emergency support funding, but we're still seeking additional clarity on that. The final piece is these are federal funds. We're unclear as to what reporting and tracking will be required from the Department of Ed for the disbursement of these funds. We assume that there will be some reporting and tracking and probably less than we would see on the traditional Title IV side, but we're still awaiting additional guidance on that. So wanted to provide that a little bit as a framing for some of the funding that we know is coming from a federal level to support emergency aid programs, and that is driving a lot of the interest and traffic in this topic. I'm going to turn it over to Steve Smith now, who will walk through some of the elements of lessons learned that we've had from our program, but then also to take a look at some of the ongoing steps that campuses can take to prepare for this funding, despite the fact that we have so many uncertain elements that are outstanding.
Very good. Thank you, Brian. And as Brian said, there are still a lot of unanswered questions about exactly how this money will be required to be distributed and some of the rules around it. But we're going to talk today about what we know about existing emergency aid programs, some of the operational things about it, which we expect will go into the delivery of this money too, so you can help prepare for when this money arrives and how you might distribute it. So just a little bit about what's out there. Some of you probably offer these today. Their emergency aid across campuses takes several forms. Vouchers, these are like, here's some extra meal in the dining hall type of thing. Completion scholarship, this is sort of, the student is at the very end, but needs just a little boost, maybe with the cost of attendance to get to the end, so there's that. Emergency loans, exactly as they state, a couple of $100 you have to repay. Food pantries, restricted grants, these would be monies that are maybe set up by a donor for a certain population of students, and unrestricted grants, funds available to the general population of students that don't have to be repaid. In the next slide. Schools offer a combination of these. Schools offer, sometimes only one of them. Emergency loans are the most common, followed by unrestricted grants. And again, unrestricted grant is a grant that's just available for any student who's enrolled at the institution, followed by other types. So often you will see campuses having a mix of these different types of programs. Okay, next. So we're going to talk a little bit about, we did talk about what these are, unrestricted and restricted grants. Probably the emergency aid that we're going to be receiving from the federal government will be most like an unrestricted grant program, most likely. But we'll get into that as we go through. Okay, next. Okay, so thinking through how to set up a delivery system for the money that you are likely to receive at your institution for distribution for emergencies. So here are some challenges that are, we see very often in institutions. Decentralized. one department has a little bit of pot of money, the financial aid office has some money, the dean of students has some money. So sometimes in campuses, you see emergency aid programs throughout the campus. Student, there isn't a central place to get them. So that's often what you see. Unclear guidance, one rule here, one rule there. Slow decision making. Sometimes the student has to apply and maybe the committee meets only every other Friday. And so it could be a couple of weeks before something happens. Sometimes the ongoing funding or is this going to be there tomorrow isn't clear. And sometimes we don't have a real good administrative system set up to make sure that there's good controls over the money. These are some of the challenges that exist today in emergency aid programs. Next. So when we're thinking through about how do we set up a program that's successful, we don't repeat the mistakes that we know are out there, and we set this up for success. Here's some things to think about. First of all, define the campus stakeholders. Who's going to be involved in this program? Who's going to make decisions about it? Who's going to deliver it? Who's going to control it? Who's going to support it administratively? We need to think those through. We're going to talk about that in a second. Define the hierarchy of needs. In other words, there may be many, many needs students have, but are they all going to be funded through the emergency aid program? We need to think through. These are very important. These are less important. Let's think through those. And let's think about the mechanics. How do we actually take the money from our school account and put it either in the hands of the students or paying a vendor on behalf of the student? How are we going to make that happen? Okay, next. Okay, who's involved? So we talk about defining stakeholders. We need to think through everybody who needs to be involved in the program. So primary stakeholders, these are the people who are going to administer the program, make decisions, deliver the money, that kind of thing. These are the people who are directly involved in the program. Secondary stakeholders are going to be everybody else who needs to know about it or needs to be part of it. So for example, faculty. The faculty most likely are not going to be decision makers about these emergency aid. They're not going to be involved in distributing the money, but they certainly need to know what the program is, how to refer students, because students are going to be talking to the faculty, often as the very first person or maybe the only person they talk to at the campus. So that person, that secondary stakeholder, knows how to connect the student to the primary sources. Okay, next. All right, so let's talk about some potential stakeholders at your campus, some likely stakeholders. Dean of Students. This office is usually an executive position. May have different types of names, but this person usually oversees student support writ large. So, very typical in emergency aid programs, this is the office that is the primary holder, decision maker of emergency aid funding. Sometimes financial aid offices are in that seat, but more often than not, emergency aid programs are more into a student support or student affairs type of office. So they're not often part of the financial aid office. So very typically your existing delivery system may be in the Dean of Students office. So this office may play an important role in this emergency aid money as well by being the executive champion, the executive decision maker, coordinating the program, and certainly making sure that all those secondary stakeholders we talk about, your faculty, your other support administrative offices, that everybody knows about it. Okay, next. Okay, IT. IT needs to set up some things like a online application and potentially some tracking tools that you will need for when you're reporting the funds. Okay, the next. Your business office, obviously going to play a huge role. They're going to be involved in making sure the payments go to the students, either direct to the student or possibly to a vendor or both. So for example, there's some ways in which you may have to pay the student directly. So now you need to have the students' direct deposit information. If they're not already a Title IV aid recipient, maybe you don't have their bank account information to give them, you know, a refund and stuff. So you have to get that. In some cases, you may deliver the money directly to the student, but what if it's something like an airline ticket that has to be purchased with a credit card and the student doesn't have a credit card? Maybe the campus needs to have a P-card that can do that on behalf of the student. So delivery of money, very important, okay? And has to be quick, because emergency is only good if you pay quickly, okay? Next. Financial aid office obviously needs to be involved, needs to understand what's going on. It's often the first place students go to look for emergency sources of money. The financial aid may be maybe part of the decision-making committee. They're also going to want to be involved in looking for other sources of regular Title IV for the student. And of course, you know, part of the CARES Act allows you to move SEOG money into emergency aid, and the financial aid office likely will have to do that on behalf of the campus. Okay, next. Registrar, making sure that they're enrolled, continuing to be a part of the tracking process for assessment. Almost certainly there's going to be requirements around this money about reporting. Your registrar is almost certainly going to have to be involved in that. Okay, next. Okay, and then as we mentioned earlier, other parts of the institution need to understand what this program's about so that they can refer students to it quickly, seamlessly, and simply. So we need to get the word out exactly what it is and how the students access it. Okay, next. All right. And I believe that I'm turning it back over to my colleague Brian Ashton at this point for the next part.
Thanks, Steve. Appreciate that, and appreciate the overview of the stakeholders. So the second step that we really wanted to walk through is the idea of understanding the needs that are on campus. And so when we think about sort of what's in statute, as well as how many campuses that we work with traditionally define emergency aid, you see different pockets that emerge for what they prioritize in terms of emergencies and student need. And so we like to think about these prioritization of need buckets. And if we can inform that based on data and student conversations, that is certainly preferable. But this is really what we see as the second step in establishing an emergency aid program. If we go to the next slide here, we did a survey. Trellis conducts an annual student financial wellness survey, and this survey was administered on 78 campuses in the fall of 2019. So this is pre-COVID-19, but we asked students if they would have trouble coming up with $500 or cash or credit in order to meet an unexpected expense or need within the next month. 61% of students at a public 2-year indicated they would, 57% at all 4 years, so public and private indicated they would as well. And so this is before some of the economic impact that we've seen from COVID-19 over the last few weeks, but it underscores the need for some of these small dollar programs to support student emergencies as they arise that may impact student completion. If we go to the next slide here, this question, we also asked students if they worried about being able to meet current monthly expenses, things like housing, food, etc. Just over 50% at both 2-year and 4-year institutions indicated that they worried about meeting current monthly expenses. Again, this was pre-COVID-19, and so we anticipate that these numbers are likely going to be a little bit higher than normal. If we transition here to the next slide, we also asked students how many times they've run out of money. And we define this really as, kind of getting to a point where there was nothing left for the student or the individual to spend. At our 2-year institution, 73% of students indicated they ran out of money 1 or more times. 53% said they did 3 or more times, and 33% indicated that they did 5 or more times. Those numbers are similar, just a little bit lower for our 4-year institutions. Again, that's a blend of public and private, with 66% indicating 1 or more times, 44% 3 or more, and 25% indicating 5 or more. So if we go to the next slide here, Steve will jump in a little bit with the application process, but what we see from those numbers is that we know that there is need in the student body and that there was need prior to COVID-19, which allows us to say that there is likely more need after COVID-19. The other thing that we know is that despite the large numbers that we're talking about in terms of stimulus and distribution to campuses, there will likely still be scarcity. And so we will likely not be able to fund every student who has need or fund all of our students to support them throughout their emergencies. And so the application process then, sort of based on what we anticipate our student need is going to be, really becomes the next step in the process to develop an emergency aid program.
Right, so as Brian just showed, the research shows, students are already vulnerable. So this just compounds the vulnerability. So we want to decrease the friction, and we want to make our process such that it is accessible, it doesn't create more stress, it moves the student from the existing insecurity to perhaps the point of a little bit better standing. And we need to think through how we're going to do that through our application process. Okay, next step. So we do need to think through, we mentioned earlier, about what are the most important needs. So we'll think through those. The federal regulations are going to give some broad guidelines about that, but certainly think of things like what are the basic needs are likely going to have a higher priority than secondary needs. Food, shelter, that kind of thing being basic needs versus, say, other types of requests that students may make. How are we going to make decisions once we get the application? So first of all, timing. The student needs to have a very clear, accessible, low friction application. It needs to get in the hands of the decision makers very quickly, and the decision makers need to act quickly. Many campuses make a decision by committee, which is a good idea because then you don't have one person controlling everything. Sometimes it's a little bit more formulaic, like a rubric, but in any case, how are we going to make the decision on the student's application? We need to iron that out and make sure it works very fast. We need to make sure we get this money out. Very often we see, with existing pots of emergency aid, let's wait and see if the big emergency happens. Let's wait a little longer, wait a little longer, and then next thing you know, you're at the end of the term and you haven't spent the money. So we need to make sure that we go ahead and get it out there so that it meets the need. And then, again, make sure that there's enough transparency so the students feel that it's accessible and that it's fair. Okay, next. So a couple of ways to disperse. The federal guidelines may give us some specifics about this, but there's two ways that happen today: directly to the student or directly to a vendor. They have their advantages and disadvantages. Directly to the student, the student then can take care of it, and there's a low administrative requirement on the college. But directly to the vendor sometimes allows it to be, we make sure that the emergency is being met. And also sometimes, as we mentioned before, like in the case of the big ticket airline, maybe the student doesn't have the ability to pay a vendor because he or she doesn't have a credit card. Okay, so we need to think it through. Could be a combination of both. Timely disbursements, again, it needs to be fast. In the program we run that Brian talked about in the very beginning, we ask that the institutions make a decision on the application within 2 days and fund the program, fund the emergency within 2 days. So there's a 4-day maximum time frame between the student approaches you and the emergency is met. And then also just make sure it is going to be a federal program. There's going to be reporting required, most likely. Make sure that our application captures whatever data we need from the beginning so we don't have to go looking for it later. Very, very critical. Okay, next. Controls. Controls, it's a lot of money. It's very easy to make mistakes with a lot of money. Make sure we have good accountability. We know exactly where the applications are and what step, exactly how much money has gone out, to whom, and make sure that there's multiple offices with their eyes on the whole process so that not one person is in charge of making decisions and funding the program. That's a standard operating procedure in all money today, but we need to make sure we operate with similar controls over this money so that it stays safe and it stays very transparent. Okay, at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Sana Magani to wrap it up.
Okay, thank you, Steve, and thank you, Brian, and thank you everyone for hanging on with us. We will be wrapping up here shortly, and we'll be available to take your questions. So we're now at the point where we're thinking about program visibility, and in this environment, promotion is even more important than before. And so what we mean by this is, how will you get the information to students that need it the most? Where are you promoting the application? Where are you promoting the program? Is it clear where students can go to ask questions? Is it clear where they can go to seek additional support? And more importantly also is, do other campus stakeholders know that are aware of the program, and are they also getting the word out to students? We have found many times that, you know, perhaps everyone in the Dean of Students office is really aware, or in financial aid they're aware, but then the faculty are not on board, or they're not aware of the program. And so are you communicating clearly across the campus to all stakeholders, to all administrators, to all people on the front line, so that the information is getting to our students and that they are fully aware of what to expect and where to go if they need additional resources and support. We also recommend that you designate a campus point person for these efforts, whether that person lives in, you know, the comms office, the marketing office, or they are, you know, in financial aid or the Dean of Students. It's essential to have someone dedicated to promoting and communicating the program to all students and to stakeholders. It's also important to create a hotline or email address to respond to these questions quickly. So in this environment where students cannot walk into your office and, you know, wait or grab a ticket to speak to someone, it needs to be really clear, one, where they can go to access the application and submit it and the process, but two, also, if they have questions or if they need to speak to someone, or, you know, maybe they are worried about something in particular and the application wasn't clear or didn't answer their question, where can they go? And so we recommend that you create a point person and the hotline to respond to these questions. And then finally, this is just a summary of what Steve and Brian went over earlier in the presentation, but we created this slide as a step-by-step for the practitioners here on the call want to see, like, well, what do I need to do next? So to summarize, one, identify the professionals to administer the program and a committee to make the decisions. And then also you want to define emergency and how students need to document the emergency. You want to write clear, simple student application that allows, you know, that has the emergency type and dollar amount and captures the data that you will need that will potentially be required in reporting. Of course, we don't know all of that yet, but also just, you know, as someone who's been a practitioner who has worked in emergency aid programs, I have found that the data we captured in the application helped us inform, you know, iterations of the program in the future. You want to, like Steve talked about this, create a system of disbursement, and of course, make it extremely visible for everyone on campus, the students, stakeholders, and then develop a data collection system to be able to help you award the funds. So immediate action, immediate next steps. So you want to develop a list of campus stakeholders that you want to engage. You want to explore mechanisms for online application and distribution. Many of you may have already started, are in this phase and are thinking about, okay, well, what do we need to do next? Well, next steps are developing awarding criteria and exploring campus-based data that would be helpful. Look for a single sign-on integration to reduce friction, make it seamless, easy for students to sign in, to submit their application. Appoint a point person and develop contact channels, assess relevant approval bodies, and have multiple. You may have multiple at this point, depending on who you have in the committee, and develop a series of controls. And then here we thought that it might be helpful to think about what might be anticipated hurdles. And we listed them in the form of questions because we know that many of you are grappling with these right now. I won't go through all of these questions. We'll have it here on the slide. But one thing I'd like to just point to is there are a lot of moving pieces when trying to set this up quickly. And one thing that, Steve and Brian have both stressed is how are we going to collaborate with other stakeholders on campus to amplify messaging and help with implementation. Doing this in a remote environment is challenging and tricky. And so to whatever degree that you can continue to collaborate with your colleagues, to connect with them and to see what questions or issues they're seeing when they work with students is going to be really important, so that it is a continuous sort of learning effort, and we're coming back as a committee, as a group of stakeholders to assess, well, how are we doing? Do we need to tweak anything? Are there any adjustments that need to be made? Are we communicating robustly and clearly with our students? And so these are all questions and hurdles that we will all have to face in the coming days. And so we'll have this slide up here. And of course, we will be also sending out the recording, but now it's time to think about what questions you may have, if you have any best practices that you would like to share with our community here that signed on, or if you have any questions for us, now is the time to send it in the Q&A or to send it in the chat. And so I'll allow for just a couple of minutes here to get the questions in. And we'll have, I will address the questions to both Brian and Steve.
So as we're aggregating those questions, a couple things that I want to kind of add as we start the Q&A portion of this. There are still quite a few elements that are up to interpretation and that we're awaiting guidance on from the department. So we may not be able to give satisfactory answers to all of the questions that are provided. That being said, the American Council on Education, or ACE, has released a expected amount of funding that campuses will get from the CARES Act as it relates to the Higher Education Relief Fund. Obviously, 50% of that funding goes to, or is supposed to go towards, student emergencies. When you look at that number, that can help to give you an idea of the scope of funding that will be at your disposal. And then based off of that, it will allow you to have some of the on-campus conversations about triaging or prioritizing what type of need you want to fill with the funding that is available.
So we have, Brian and Steve, we have our first round of questions in, and the first question we have is, can the CARE Act funds cover tuition and fees in the form of a scholarship?
Yeah, so I think that's one of the things that we are still awaiting interpretation on. It was not clear in the guidance, although tuition I don't believe was called out in the legislative language, and so that might be a little bit harder of a sell than fees, but we are awaiting guidance as to whether or not institutions can fund themselves.
Thanks, Brian. Steve, did you want to add anything to that, or? Okay.
No, that's correct, yes.
Okay, great. Our next question is, will these funds be counted toward cost of attendance?
So we did cover this earlier in the presentation a little bit. Right now, if you go to the IFAP website and you see the guidance from the Department of Education, they have given us sort of a regulatory relief until June 30th on counting it in estimated financial assistance or as income. But as Brian mentioned, what happens after June 30th, there may be emergency aid money left over, and you may have to treat it differently after June 30th. Right now, when it comes in, you don't have to treat it, at least until June 30th, as estimated financial assistance or as income, according to the guidance that is currently on the IFAP website. But after that, we're not sure. Brian, anything more on that?
Nope.
Our next question comes from many, actually many participants have a similar question, and it is, will funds be disseminated from the financial aid office, or are they going through G5?
I think we're still waiting guidance on that.
Yeah, we are. The only indication that we've received so far, and it hasn't been formalized or in writing at this point, is that it will be using Title IV distribution vehicles. Again, that's still subject to change, but that's the guidance that we've received up until this point. So we do envision that the financial aid office will have some role potentially in drawing down that funding. I'm also seeing, while we're talking about that, I'm seeing some questions about the allocation to institutions and whether or not an institution needs to apply. Institutions at this point do not need to apply for the funding. There is an allocation method that is outlined in the legislation that allocates based on Pell percentages of students as well as some enrollment variables. And that is part of the ACE calculation. So the American Council on Education has that available, what their estimated allocations will be for campuses. Again, they stress, and I would stress, that that is still just an estimate, but it can give you an idea of what the allocation may be to the campus for the entirety of that relief funding that will be coming your way.
Another question that many participants have asked today is what information should be captured by on the application, and if we have sample applications that we could share.
So I guess a couple of questions are on our, we can share a sample application that we have offered to some of the institutions that participate in our program, and we can make that available for others to look at. It is pretty simple. It just tries to capture the students' basic information and what the nature of the emergency is. So our philosophy is reduce friction, simple, accessible. The one warning I would say, though, is when we see the regulatory package, make sure that we read what downstream reporting is going to be required, because if there's something the student needs to answer in that is going to be required for later reporting, you don't want to be in a position of having to go chase down the student months later to get that information from them. So that is probably the biggest caution. You'll need to know what the student's name is, the address, maybe his or her bank account information, that kind of stuff, and what the nature of the emergency is and how much they were requesting, but also just be very cognizant of other reporting requirements that may be needed.
And as a general note there too, I agree with everything that Steve said. To the extent that we add more questions or other items onto the application process, it increases the friction for students, which may make it harder for them to complete the application process. And so, while we may want to, certainly as Steve alluded to, we're going to want to capture everything that we need to from a regulatory perspective and from an assessment perspective. I think it's more important than ever to really think critically about what do we need to use and what do we intend to use versus what is just nice to have, and do we really need to collect that from the student, to make sure that we're removing some of the friction points that might prevent students who really need the funding from being able to apply.
Absolutely, and I would just add on to that. Do think about whether you need a lot of backup documentation and things like that. So very often I will see schools going above. We'll recommend a very simple application, but they want students to document the need, document the receipts, things like that. That may be required, but do you need the receipt for $20, $25, or can you just say, we'll go for the big ticket items? Again, try to make it simple. My recommendation, don't make them write a personal essay about, how they're learning from this experience as a part of the money condition. I'm just using it as a hypothetical, but sometimes you see things like that out there. Just make it a simple application that captures the minimum.
And when we send out the website with the webinar recording and slide, we'll add on sample applications there. So for those of you that had that question. Another question that we received was, are funds restricted to only FAFSA filers and Pell eligible students?
So at this time, our understanding of that question is that it is not restricted to only Title IV recipients, but it is available to the entirety of the student body. That being said, like Steve mentioned earlier, it's important to think about some of the considerations for non-Title IV recipients in terms of disbursement. Do you have direct deposit information? Do you have other things that can help to get the money out quickly to those students, or will there need to be a process in place to distribute outside of your traditional Title IV refund process that you may have?
Okay, thanks, Brian. Our next question is, which higher education office will administer the funds, and how will funds be distributed?
Well, those are questions that, one, may be defined by the department's guidance that comes out about the money, and two, maybe just institutional decisions about what is the best practice. So we don't know right now what the answer to that is, because there could be guidance about that. But one thing to consider, oftentimes the first go-to is the financial aid office, but sometimes, it is better to operate these types of programs outside the financial aid office so that students don't think of them as financial aid programs. They're really not financial aid programs in the classic sense. They're really a stopgap to solve this specific emergency. So that's, maybe something to consider too, and also just bandwidth from you have. But a lot of the questions You asked about where should they be distributed for and what are the methods of delivery. Those are potentially going to be in the guidance package we get from the Department of Ed, and if not, they have to be practical decisions that the campus needs to make.
Okay, and we have about a few more minutes left before the end of the webinar, and we do want to be mindful of everyone's time. So I'll ask our final few questions. The first one is, would these funds be used to reimburse emergency aid already distributed or recently distributed to students, and is there an effective date?
So as of right now, we don't have a effective date in place, and we don't have clarity as to whether or not it can be used to support emergency aid that was previously dispersed. If we follow some of the other CARES Act provisions that are or have been released, we've seen that effective date often going back to enactment, which I think was March 27th. To combine this with another question that I've seen come in, there was a question around commingling of funds from emergency aid programs that a school may already have in place. One of the things that I think is key to answering that question, as well as the question that was asked about reimbursement for previous funds, is that it'll be dependent on the guidance that the department has for what type of documentation is needed to support the release of the emergency aid. And so if they're assuming that there will be some level of requirements for documentation, then there could potentially be the ability to commingle institution's emergency aid program if it meets the requirements of the department's emergency aid program, but you likely wouldn't be able to take the federal dollars and apply them to your program's emergency aid requirements unless they met the federal requirements. We're not clear when this guidance will be issued. I know that there's been a lot of pressure from NASFA and the National Governors Association and other trade associations to try to get the department to issue guidance as quickly as possible, and we know that that's in everybody's best interest. But we also know that the department is issuing guidance on a lot of different topics right now, and so we're hopeful to see something over the next few weeks. But realize that there's a strong backlog over there of things that they've needed to respond to, especially as it relates to the CARES Act.
Okay, and the final question that we'll be taking today is, do you require anything from students such as commitment to continue at the institution or take all loans before receiving emergency aid?
There is no guidance about that, and I would say the context of this law would not include those provisions in them. They are the law is not written with a lot of condition other than it helps deal with the COVID-19 emergency.
Okay, thanks, Steve. Brian, anything that you want to add as we wrap up here today?
No, I don't think so. I want to thank everybody for their attendance and their patience. Obviously, this was to begin to get campuses to think about what it may look like to have an emergency aid on campus and to begin to have some of those conversations with the various stakeholders on your campus. We think it's really important to start to think about the application process, get IT involved, get your various other stakeholders involved prior to the disbursement of the aid coming out. We will do our best to answer the questions that we've received that we didn't get to as a part of the webinar and send those out over the next few days. And we will also do our best to continue to update the attendees on additional guidance as we receive it. At Trellis, we do plan on releasing some additional emergency aid related resources over the next few weeks, which will hopefully be helpful for all the campuses that are on this call as they begin to think through what it looks like to have an emergency aid program on campus.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. Thanks, Steve. And in the background, thanks to Zach for fielding all the questions, and to Ryan, our other panelist who's on as well. We appreciate you all taking time out of your day and joining us today. We know there is a lot happening and things are changing every single day. So thank you again. We hope that you're staying safe and healthy, and that if you have any other questions or we weren't able to get to your questions, you'll hear from me in hopefully a couple of days. I'll have the PowerPoint slides for you. I'll have the webinar recording, of course, and you'll have my contact information. So if we were unable to answer your question, feel free to send me an email and I will answer your question or at least get you the right resource. On this page right now, we have resources. We also have references in case you want to go back and look at any of the studies or research we talked about. Again, thank you all. Take care and we'll be in touch soon.
Thank you, everyone.
Have a great day.